afternoon. Myself, Dr. Sandeep Tripathi. It's my great honor to have opportunity to extend my warm welcome for today's distinguished guest, Professor Harsh V. Pant, and today's program moderator, Mr. Don McLean-Gill. On behalf of the Forum for Global Studies, I would like to extend my heartily welcome Professor Harsh V. Pant. Professor Harsh V. Pant is a professor of international relations at King's College London, United Kingdom. Professor Pant is also the Director of Studies and Head of Strategic Studies at Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. Professor Pant is a non-resident fellow with the Vidwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Washington, D.C. Professor Pant writes regularly various for media outlets, including the Japan Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Hindustan Times, and the Telegraph. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. We are so grateful for having with you. Now, I would like to extend my warm welcome to today's moderator, my colleague, Don McLean-Gill. Mr. Don McLean-Gill is the Research Director at Forum for Global Studies, as well as he's also as Resident Fellow at the International Development and Security Council in the Philippines. Thank you so much, Don McLean-Gill, for having with us. So I would like to invite today's moderator to take floor for proceed the next program. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sandeep. And once again, thank you, Professor Pant, for accepting our humble invitation for the FGS interview. Now, to look into the shifting geopolitical landscape in the Indo-Pacific and its implications for India, we are honored to have Professor Harsh Pant as our special guest this afternoon. Now, Professor Pant, you have been a phenomenal inspiration to many students of international relations such as me, and I even remember immersing myself in your books at the India's Embassy's Library in Manila during my internship there. So it is a true honor to have you here, sir.
Thank you, Don.
Now, to begin with our discussion, sir, with Prime Minister Modi in the US for a series of important engagements and strategic partners, particularly in the context of the Quad, which has concluded, it is first worth exploring some major events that took place a few days prior. Now, the establishment of the new trilateral security alliance between Australia, the UK, and the US, termed AUKUS, aims to not only center on building a class of nuclear-propelled submarines, but also looks into a collaborative framework to work together in the Indo-Pacific. Now, Professor Pant, could you please share your thoughts and your opinion on the timing of such a development, given that the Quad leaders meeting was scheduled just a few days after?
Thanks, Don, and thanks, Sandeep, for having me today. And also, let me say that let me pay you a compliment. I think it's wonderful to see youngsters being so proactive and taking such great interest. When I was your age, probably I was not doing anything or not even would be bothered to do anything, but certainly to see youngsters, young voices in geopolitics and foreign policy for far too long. We have given great, credit to our seniors, and I think gray hair has used to be one of the criteria of being on television or on being screens. I think now there is greater democratization. I think greater space for younger voices. So it's wonderful that you are doing what you are doing, and please. All my best wishes. Do more, write more, and hopefully that will lead to a better conversation around some of these themes. And now coming to the question, it's interesting because so much is happening, and it's happening so fast that often, as an analyst or as an observer, you struggle to figure out what exactly some of these things mean in real terms. But I think. One of the ways in which perhaps one can get one's head around this is that finally countries in the region and beyond who have a stake in the Indo-Pacific are waking up to the real challenge that they face. And the challenge is very simple, that not only China is rising in multiple domains, but also the strategic environment is such that we don't have any frameworks to look at this challenge and to map out a response. If you were, say, just a decade back, if you were talking about, first of all, there was no Indo-Pacific a decade back. Even if you were talking about Asia Pacific, you would rely on usual, things like saying, all right, it's dependent on China economically, it's dependent on America strategically. There is ASEAN there is East Asia Summit there are powers who rely on, who will hedge, who will balance. I think we are now at an inflection point where the recognition is that older paradigm is no longer working, and countries really need to up their game. If you want any kind of a response, if you want to be able to respond in any significant manner to the challenge that you are facing. So the structural challenge, the institutional challenge, the normative challenge, all of them are coming together and almost, waking you up from your slumber if you are a policymaker. And therefore, a lot of these ideas, which at one point, for example, Quad at one point was rejected by Australians, by Indians, we have seen how dynamic it has become in a matter of 6 months for American administration to call 2 meetings of Quad in less than 6 months is itself a marker of how things are changing. And then you are struggling with, figuring out whether this would be enough. So what is, how much is enough and what are the mechanisms available to you? So I think a lot of this is also experimentation. A lot of this is also about doing something, testing the waters, seeing how far you can go, what sort of messages you can send, whether that would be enough. So I think in that context, one has to look at Quad, but also look at AUKUS, this very awkward sounding platform or a security relationship that Australia, US, and UK have articulated. In some ways, it tells you that choices are being made, certain choices that countries were not willing to make even 2 years back, they are making today. So Australia is willing to make a choice that it would now openly ask America for help on certain areas which were out of bounds, say a year back. America is also now willing to bet that it is willing to empower regional allies more than perhaps it would have thought it was needed in the past. So we are looking at an interesting, equation, a number of interesting equations emerging. In the plethora of these geometries that are emerging in the Indo-Pacific. We have had a number of trilaterals in the past as well. We have if you look at India, Japan, Australia, for example, doing supply chain resilience initiative, right? So you have domain specific trilaterals. You have also had India, Australia, Indonesia. We have had Japan, Australia, US, of course, working together, and then it resulted in the Quad. And now I think with the entry of European states in the mix, we are looking at a greater sense of dynamism in these relationships. So my own sense is that this is just the beginning. I think we will see more and more of these developments because we don't have any template. And there is, the Indo-Pacific is too big and too wide so that to be able to create, to be able to evolve into an institutional mechanism in the short term. And I think short term is important now in the game. If this is a strategic game, then everyone is looking for the next move. And I think these moves are aimed at sending out messages not only to your partners and allies, but also to China, also to other actors, that this is how things are going to move. So I think AUKUS that way fills a kind of a void in that space where countries like Australia and the US were not willing to bear certain costs. Now they are saying we are willing to bear certain costs, right? So this is a cost that US is saying we are willing to bear, even if this means alienating France. For Russia, even if this for Australia, this means that now China can yes, of course, this is going to be a big challenge. China is going to be even more annoyed, but this is something that we have to do. And UK is, of course, bringing its own heft here. UK wants to be part of the larger Global Britain project. They want to have a leg in the Indo-Pacific, so they are happy to be here. So I think AUKUS that way is something that for these three countries at least fills a certain void. For others, in India, if you look at it from a broader perspective, there is nothing really problematic about it. That there is, in a sense, in the strategic sense, that here is a partner like Australia and a partner like America, both trying to re-engage on a set of new terms of engagement. And if that means that that the Pacific will see a greater degree of stability, then that is good. I think where it is complicating things for India is in this larger worldview that India would like, and India knows that we need a much broader coalition. And alienating France perhaps maybe may not be that big, may not be a very wise move from New Delhi's perspective, both bilaterally because India shares a very important relationship with France, but also I think more regionally, where France increasingly is willing to play a larger role in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that is the context in which India would like that coalition to be preserved and maintained. Now, of course, in foreign policy, it's not a one-way street. You act and you react, and others act and others react. So I think there are limits to what India can and cannot do in this context. But I think certainly one thing that India would try to do is to make sure that America, that the UK, and even Australia, I think are cognizant of the reality that France should be given the space that it needs to play a larger role in the Indo-Pacific. And that we are already seeing happening. Americans have talked to France. There is a Biden and Macron they have talked to each other. Australians are also trying to make a diplomatic outreach to France to mend fences. It will take time, but ultimately there is no alternative to a broader coalition in the Indo-Pacific, like-minded countries. And for India, that is an imperative, and that is where India would like to go. But this is something that India, of course, could not have. India's intervention was not possible in AUKUS, and AUKUS is something that others are doing in the region for their own interests. And if it helps India in the strategic sense, it's good. But the method of doing this, the method of taking it forward, perhaps could have been better. The articulation could have been better. Americans could have been more sensitive to some of the challenge that this will pose to France. And I think that is something that we will see how it evolves. But by and large, AUKUS will be a complementing factor to the Quad, hopefully, if the present trends continue.
Thank you so much, Professor Pant. And you have rightfully and wonderfully mentioned all the necessary points that we have to take into consideration, considering, as you have mentioned, the dynamic landscape, the geopolitical landscape of the Indo-Pacific, and of course, emerging threats have catalyzed states to act more proactively, unlike how they were probably a few years back. And this is an important development, especially in interstate relations and the overall stability and peace of the Indo-Pacific. But as you have also mentioned, so you've mentioned about France, you've mentioned Europe. These are very important points, which I would like to ask in the next few questions. But you've also mentioned about the AUKUS being a result of the dynamic changes in the Indo-Pacific. However, you've also highlighted the certain issues regarding the exclusivity and, of course, the process of its establishment. Now, if I could build up on that particular note, sir. Given that it is a pivotal major power in the Indo-Pacific and a crucial pillar of the Quad, as you've mentioned, sir, should India be relatively concerned for the long-term effects of the AUKUS, particularly in relation to the Quad? Or is it something, as you have mentioned, to be a rather complementary framework? Could you expound on this a little bit more, Professor Pant?
Yes, I think, because we are in a completely new terrain when it comes to Indo-Pacific and the rapidity of the change, I think these kind of issues will arise continuously as countries try to map out their own strategic trajectories. And so what is important is to avoid the kind of misunderstandings that would fray the coalition, right? So if there is a broad coalition, it works well against the emerging threats. If that coalition is frayed, if there is space for our adversaries to play one party against the other, then that's not good. So the means of moving forward, I think, are important in this, equally important as the outcome. Now, in this case, outcome perhaps is not that problematic from India's point of view. See, a lot of this, I see some of the discussion that is happening in Indian media these days, and in India generally about AUKUS. And people have raised this question that, look, India also needs these technologies, like what Australia is getting, nuclear-powered submarine technology. India has all. This would help India to project power. But the issue is that there are certain aspects of this conversation which India has to first resolve on its own. See, here is the problem. That expectation from outside world, when you say we expect America to do this, and why is America doing this with Australia and not with India? There is a fairly obvious reason. Australia is a treaty alliance partner of the US. India is not. Now, India is saying, or India has continued to maintain a position, at least the strategic community, that we value our strategic autonomy. We don't want to be an alliance partner. We would like to, often you also hear senior, even in this context, you also hear some very responsible voices saying, perhaps it's best to avoid getting too close to the Americans. Now, if that is the narrative, then I think our expectation from America should also be relatively subdued, right? America is not going to supply you those kind of technologies without you affirming that you also want to take the relationship to a higher notch. So what is it? I think that the debate ultimately has to be within India, and the resolution has to be within India. The AUKUS has largely been, and this has to be acknowledged, that even Australians have had a long-standing debate on China. Even today, if you see Australian media, there are voices who say it's not good to go all out against China, that we have to balance China and America. Now, but Australia, it seems, has, in the policy terms, has resolved this problem. They've said, no, enough is enough. We have to take a position, and now we are positioning ourselves opposite China. We are positioning ourselves as a treaty alliance partner, which we were, but we were trying to avoid those kind of decisions. We are now going to make that decision. We are going to be solidly with the Americans on this question. And as a quid pro quo, America will enhance our technological base. So I think what AUKUS has shown is a certain kind of a arrangement, is a security alliance between three actors, which traditionally have had a closer relationship. And after a lot of back and forth, one of them, in this case, Australia, deciding to resolve that debate and saying, well, we remain part of the Anglosphere. For a long time, there was this thing in Australia that we have to maintain some distance from America, because otherwise China will get annoyed and this and that. But that clearly did not pay them any dividends. So what is it that India is going to, how is it that India is going to resolve its own internal debate? So I think, and if you don't want to do that, then I think our expectation should also be that it would be ultimately some of these technologies, it will be difficult for us to get. I mean, we have got very far with the Americans. Imagine us, early 1990s when Cold War ended, and now when we, the meeting with Mr. Biden and between Mr. Biden and Mr. Modi exemplifies that it is now a relationship of different order. But still, can any Indian Prime Minister declare tomorrow that we are going to be an alliance? Alliance, we don't use the word alliance. We say we are strategic partners. It's an ambiguous word. It retains its ambiguity, but that's something that's politically sustainable in India. So if that is the case, then I think the expectations on certain kinds of technologies should also be limited. There is a counter argument to that as well, which is that, look, if America wants to manage China's rise, then India has to be, Indian interests will have to be taken into account. Then India should be given technological help, political help, diplomatic help, so that it meets the China challenge. And we have seen a lot of that happening from the American side. We have seen some of that happening from Indian side. India has signed most of the foundational agreements. America has moved from the nuclear deal now to the to other aspects of technological engagement. So we are seeing that. But I think to compare Australia and India is a mistake. They are two different entities with two different ideas about their own strategic trajectories and certain decisions that Australia can make easily, India can't. So therefore, you will always see this disparity. But broadly, I think, again, because India's relations with Australia today are what they are, very strong, very robust, and because India's relations with America are very strong, I think what Quad does is it does not create a direct dilemma for India. Broadly, it is good for India. It complements the efforts of Quad, because Quad even today is uneasy when it comes to hard power. If you see the Quad agenda, it's largely on non-security matters, because there is a problem of consensus. There is a problem that 3 of the 4 countries are treaty alliance partners of each other. India is not. So I think the Quad agenda is moving gradually. It has moved quite a fair bit in the last year or so. But I think to get that strategic edge, a lot of it rides on India and India's decisions. If India is comfortable with what it is today, then I think India will have to navigate this differently. And then therein you can bring in France, and you can say, well, to what extent will France help us in getting some of these technologies? And that is the space that India has with France. This AUKUS also, in a sense, opens up that space to bargain harder with France. Now that new equations are emerging, and now that France would like to be in the Indo-Pacific but is out of Australia, so can France offer India a better deal? Can India and France come to terms with each other on these kind of technologies? So I think those are the questions that India will have to resolve, and India will have to engage with, as well as resolving the internal challenges that it faces in terms of its own foreign policy direction. Essentially, can India manage China without actually explicitly tying up with one global power bloc?
Thank you, Professor Pant, again for a very in-depth clarification of the dynamics involved regarding the AUKUS and the Quad, of course. You've rightfully mentioned, of course, the foreign policy trajectories of both the United States and India, as India prefers to secure the level of strategic autonomy as compared to Australia and the US, who are relatively treaty allies that encompass a wide array of collaborative measures. But still, on that note, as you have mentioned, sir, the United States and India have moved well beyond the Cold War and immediately post-Cold War era in terms of bolstering their strategic partnership. And we can definitely see that in terms of the engagements that have been happening throughout these present times. Now, you've mentioned China, sir, and perhaps I could ask somewhat under questioned particular issue is that the AUKUS is not free from controversy, of course, even among like-minded partners and allies. France, as we know, has expressed its greatest displeasure given the blunt process of the arrangement and the economic implications it will face. Now, Germany has also expressed its discontent. There are some responsible voices in Germany regarding the manner of how the AUKUS was formed. Furthermore, the recent pullout, if we can link it regarding the situation in Afghanistan, the recent pullout by the United States in Afghanistan has also garnered some negative feedback, particularly from Europe. Now, would this be any concern? Would there be any concern, particularly regarding this problem among the allies and the cohesion in the long run? More importantly, will this be a possible area for China to exploit, sir?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, again, here, Don, it's a long-term trajectory of US-Europe relationship. I remember when I was a student and a PhD student in the US, it was there was Iraq war debate happening, right? And that just exposed how differently US and Europe viewed the world. And some of the scholarship from that time onwards have been talking about a fundamental difference in the way Europe and US engage with global politics in the post-Cold War world. I mean, if you're a student of IR, you know the famous article by John Mearsheimer that he talked about why NATO will disappear eventually. And I think while NATO has not disappeared, the questions of Western unity are more and more palpable, right? Because it's a structural problem. Every few years it happens. And there's a famous book, The Americans Are from Mars, Europeans Are from Venus. The idea that they have very different ideas about how global politics should be. Now, some of that, of course, is changing because China has, again, as in response to your first question, China has woken up, a number of these countries, especially in Europe. Europe had been, trying not to engage with the China subject for a very, very long time. At one point, they used to openly say, we are not in the business of geopolitics. But geopolitics is something that you have to do eventually. It captures you, whether you like it or not. So now, of course, you have European Union's Indo-Pacific policy, Indo-Pacific European Union's India policy, which is quite significant, European Union's China policy, which is now very, very direct about the challenge that Europe faces from China. But I think the fundamental difference is, the differences are in their worldviews and in their capabilities. Now, European Union, I think what it has exposed, this AUKUS has exposed, what Afghan withdrawal has exposed, is how, in some ways, irrelevant Europe has become in American strategic calculus. When Mr. Trump was in power, Europe used to blame everything on Mr. Trump. That Mr. Trump is a bad man. He doesn't know how to deal with allies, and he doesn't know how to talk. He's not a diplomat. Look at Mr. Biden. He has turned out to be even more unilateralist as far as Europe is concerned. No conversation on Afghanistan happened. He just pulled out without even informing his closest allies. And now AUKUS, without informing European Union. And I think what it is doing is it is exposing that fundamental vulnerability in Europe, that strategically Europe is not a player today in global politics. And that has to be recognized. And I think this is something that India should also recognize. We keep on saying, I mean, I love France. It's a wonderful country. And I think it's a great partner for India. But if you tell me today that India and France together can stand up to the might of China in Indo-Pacific, I mean, I'm not going to buy that argument. Ultimately, you need the mightier players, and the mightier players, in the West are America and UK. Why is America engaging UK? Because UK is the most significant strategic power in the larger Europe apart from America. So there is a logic to why Americans are engaging with the UK, not with the European Union. So I think what it has exposed is this fundamental challenge, and Europeans acknowledge that. This argument that they now need an autonomous defense policy, autonomous defense capability, which Macron is pushing for it. France is saying we beyond it, because I think French are the only country that have a vision, because otherwise, if you look at Germany and other countries, they are mostly talking about economics and trade. They don't want to engage, for various historical reasons in Germany. But I think for other countries, it's a matter now of how much resources can they invest in defense. So the real challenge, I think, for Europe and America is that their capability differentials mean, and Europe's strategic irrelevance in global politics means, that the Indo-Pacific as a center of gravity shifts to the Indo-Pacific. Certainly, Europe would want a place in the Indo-Pacific, but their capabilities are just not there. And so for America to build a range of partnerships, to build a range of arrangements, America will have to rely on other countries. America can't rely on Europe. They can rely on certain things for Europe. They can rely on what can they do on trade, what can they do with on climate change, to a certain extent on infrastructure. But largely when it comes to strategic heft, there is a vacuum. And therefore you see so much investment in QUAD, that you want to raise the ability of Australians, of Japanese, of Indians to be able to do some heavy lifting, because America feels alone. And America clearly does not have the political will at the moment. If you look at the domestic debate in America, they are not increasingly engaged in these kind of conversations. Domestically, it is becoming more and more inward-looking polity. So I think those questions will continue to have a very long-term effect on this broader coalition. So you need a coalition, certainly, but coalitions will have to be built on pragmatic appraisal of what is possible and what is not. On hard power, it is just not possible to bring in Europe because Europe does not have hard power capabilities. So I think we will increasingly see more and more of these challenges emerging. And for India, of course, India would like a broad-based coalition because for India and for many countries in the region, it's not simply a question of hard power. It's also a question of technology. It's also a question of infrastructure. It's also a question of economics and trade. So they would want Europe to be heavily engaged. And of course, France has enormous territories. They have lots of territories in the Indo-Pacific. So I think their role becomes almost very germane to our calculations. But the challenge, I think, which is facing the Western world is the one that they have to figure out from within. How far can they go with these kind of capability differentials between America and Western Europe? And unless you resolve that problem, I don't see the possibility of these problems getting resolved anytime soon. I think as America looks at it more strategically, America starts, putting in resources and efforts and diplomatic capital in Indo-Pacific. They will rely more and more on other countries, non-European countries, because that's where they will find greater support and greater capabilities rather than in Europe. So unless Europe does something dramatically on the capabilities front, and that debate is happening in Europe, I think they will find that these things will keep on happening, and they will continue to feel bad. But apart from that, there is little that they can do. And we have seen that it does not matter if you have Mr. Trump in office or Mr. Biden. The results are largely the same.
Thank you so much, Professor Pant, for mapping out, of course, the reality of what Europe can do in the Indo-Pacific, and of course, what Europe can actually do in the Indo-Pacific, and of course, what it wants to do in the Indo-Pacific. So there has to be a sort of a reality check in terms of the activities involved in terms of Europe's engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Now, we have mentioned about France. You have mentioned about France, sir, and in particular, we could see that India and France have been engaging quite wonderfully, and their strategic partnership has significantly evolved throughout time. France has been a historic and traditional partner of India, and we can see a lot of positive growth and development between the two countries. Now, with the whole AUKUS scenario, and of course, France getting into the picture, of course, of the complexities involved between the AUKUS members in France, could India leverage its partnership with France and technically other European countries to to engage more rapidly and proactively in the Indo-Pacific? And would India be able to enhance the benefits of these particular strategic partnerships with European countries, looking beyond, of course, the possible supply of nuclear submarines, but other areas, technology, economic development, and of course, more other forms of strategic partnerships?
See, indeed, I mean, what we have seen is especially under this government, we have seen in India, we have seen a very significant pro-Western orientation, and almost they have made a lot of investment in Europe. Diplomatic investment in Europe, and I think the outreach to Europe has been very, very significant. And the reason is very simple, because a lot of India's developmental engagements, developmental aspirations can be fulfilled by serious engagement with Europe. Europe has the technological wherewithal, whether it is climate change, whether it is green financing, whether it is about urban mobility, whether it is about urbanization and how do you map out your new cities, whether it is digital transformation in India, skill enhancement in India. I think on all the issues, there is significant capability in Europe, which India will have to harness if you have to achieve the kind of developmental goals that you have set out for yourself. Now, I think France, of course, as you mentioned, France has been a very, very special partner for India. And then I think the historical relationship, more contemporary engagement, that has been extremely substantive, one of the most substantive in Europe, and in fact, one of the most substantive partners, strategic partners of India over the last several decades. So I think France's role in India's foreign policy calculus is very special. And I think that is why you see, I think there is a disappointment in certain quarters in India about AUKUS, because you do feel that France should not be left out, that France could have been handled better by Americans, by Australians, and the British. So there is a sense that it was not necessary, and it could have been managed better. But I think by and large, as far as India is concerned, just after AUKUS was announced, Indian Prime Minister and French President had a phone call. So I think there is clearly a recognition that this is something that from both sides, that India would want to reassure France that this is something that is unlikely to happen in India's case. And France would like to also keep India as a trusted partner, because eventually for France now, after what has happened with Australia, India is presumably the most important partner. And I think therefore, for France, it is important now to map out a long-term trajectory with India, and that opens up that space for India. Can India now engage with France on terms that perhaps would allow France to look at transfer of technology on not only on submarines, nuclear submarines, but also in other aspects much more seriously? Because a lot of the time we have seen, for example, while France has been more forthcoming than America, there has been a reluctance because it might annoy the Americans or it might annoy the West. So there has been this understanding. Now, however, under the different circumstances, can India get a better bargain from Paris? I think that's a question that many in India would be asking, and rightly so. But by and large, I think the relationship remains very, very important from India's point of view, both in terms of technology cooperation, economic cooperation, regional cooperation. Now that Angela Merkel is gone, Emmanuel Macron would be the most important player in European Union. So there is a larger reality that India faces, and can India use that leverage to enhance its ties with the European Union even more? And so I think, and finally, I think France's role in the Indo-Pacific, where India would like France to play a larger role, and France is increasingly willing to play a larger role. So those things would certainly will give a new impetus to an already dynamic India-French relationship. But I think the challenge now would be, can we use this relationship to push into the domain of broader European engagement? And can France help India leverage larger European resources to India's developmental goals?
Thank you so much, Professor Pant. And you have, again, clearly and critically explained the challenges, the limitations involved in this particular scenario. However, you've also highlighted the opportunities for India, especially to harness its partnership with key European powers, particularly France. And this boils down to my last question, Professor Pant. With all the challenges taking place in the Indo-Pacific, as you have said, this may just be the beginning. What may be some possible recommendations India must consider, given the backdrop of an ever-dynamic geopolitical landscape?
As an observer and what has happened in the last few years, I don't think we have the luxury of thinking extremely long term. There is an argument that we should have a long-term strategic thinking, which is I think right, and which is I think important. But given what is happening in the Indo-Pacific, I think that long-term strategic mapping should be inherently flexible. And I think flexibility is the name of the game today. Diplomatic flexibility. If you're not flexible enough, then I think your ability to be part of some of these conversations, and then your ability to shape some of the new emerging geometries in the region, new emerging institutions in the region, new emerging platforms in the region becomes very, very constrained. So unless India is nimble, unless India is flexible, unless India is willing also, I would say, to take some risks with its foreign policy approach, it would be difficult to manage both the rise of China and the flux in the system, because we are battling two things. One, of course, is the China challenge, but China challenge is leading to something which we have been discussing over the last half an hour or so, that it is leading other countries to act in interesting ways, in innovative ways. So innovation is the name of the game. You have to be innovative, you have to be dynamic and flexible, and unless you are willing to say that unless you are willing to make choices, certain kinds of choices, all choices have risks, costs. To say that we are going to be non-aligned and not do anything also has a cost. And to say that we are going to align also has cost. So you have to make an assessment of which costs, how much costs you're willing to bear. And I think those are the essential questions now in this domain. Some of the things in Indian foreign policy are becoming clearer. For example, the China policy is becoming clearer. I think Indian government is articulating it, and Indian government's policy response is making it clear that on certain issues, India will stand up to China. India will prevent China from entering certain critical sectors. India will take on China on global platforms. India will build partnerships that inherently are anti-Chinese in orientation. But I think beyond that, how do you leverage some of these partnerships towards your strategic and developmental agenda? And can you do that without being if you continue to be as ambiguous as you are in your strategic response? I think those are the questions that India should should try to figure out as we strive to play a much larger role in the Indo-Pacific and beyond.
Thank you, Professor Pant. And given, of course, the issues regarding an assertive China, and of course the motions, and of course the motivations of states to balance out this particular threat, has catalyzed a series of engagements in bilateral, trilateral, multilateral frameworks among like-minded partners. And as you have rightfully said, sir, this is the perfect time for India to maintain and enhance its flexibility, to be able to underscore the vulnerabilities and sensitivities that it may face, given the challenges and limitations of a very fast-shaping geopolitical landscape in the Indo-Pacific. And on that note, Professor Pant, I thank you so much for your time. And on behalf of FGS, we wholeheartedly thank you for joining us in this particular discussion, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.